In the beginning, there were no books, no libraries, no written records to preserve the sacred knowledge of the ancients. There was only memory and the human voice weaving stories beneath starlit skies. In those first gatherings around flickering fires, our ancestors understood something profound. Truth could be hidden in plain sight, wrapped in the silk of narrative, disguised as entertainment while carrying the deepest secrets of existence. The myths we dismiss as mere fantasy are, in truth, vessels carrying cargo more precious than gold, the lost knowledge of civilizations that understood the cosmos in ways we are only beginning to remember. Tonight, we journey into these ancient stories, not as children seeking entertainment, but as seekers pursuing wisdom that was deliberately encoded in tales of gods and heroes, monsters and magic, so that it might survive the collapse of empires and the burning of libraries. If this journey into history gently moves you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here. By the way, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment before you drift off, we read every single one. Long before the invention of writing, when human knowledge existed only in the living memory of those who carried it, the ancients faced a profound challenge: how to preserve their most sacred understanding across generations through wars, famines, and the inevitable forgetting that comes with time. They discovered something remarkable: that the human mind, while fragile in its ability to remember facts and figures, possessed an almost supernatural capacity to remember stories. The first memory keepers understood this truth intimately. They were the shamans and storytellers, the wise women and wandering poets who served as the living libraries of their people. These keepers of ancient wisdom developed sophisticated techniques for encoding complex knowledge into narrative structures that would survive even when the original context was lost. They wove astronomical observations into tales of divine romance, embedded agricultural wisdom in stories of seasonal gods, and preserved medical knowledge in myths of healing deities. Consider the way these ancient storytellers worked. They could not simply tell their listeners that the heliacal rising of Sirius occurred approximately every 365.25 days, marking the annual flooding of the Nile. Such information delivered as mere fact would be forgotten within a generation. Instead, they created the story of Isis weeping for her lost husband Osiris, her tears causing the sacred river to rise and bring life to the land. The goddess's annual mourning became a mnemonic device that preserved not only the timing of the flood, but also its spiritual significance to the people who depended upon it. In the oral traditions of the Aboriginal Australians, we find perhaps the most sophisticated example of knowledge preservation through mythology. The Dreamtime stories, passed down for tens of thousands of years, contain detailed maps of the continent, encoded in narratives about ancestral beings who travelled across the landscape. These stories preserve not only geographical information, but also complex ecological knowledge, which plants are edible, where water can be found, how to navigate vast distances using stars and landmarks. The Rainbow Serpent's journey describes not just a creation myth, but also the location of underground water sources, while the Seven Sisters' flight across the sky maps the seasonal availability of certain foods. The memory keepers understood that emotion was the key to retention. Stories that merely conveyed information would be forgotten, but stories that moved the heart, that inspired fear or wonder or love, would endure. This is why so many myths contain elements that seem fantastical or even disturbing to modern minds. The violence in these stories was not gratuitous. It served as an emotional anchor, ensuring that the knowledge embedded within would not slip away into the void of forgetting. The Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone appears, on the surface, to be a simple explanation for the changing seasons. But embedded within this narrative is sophisticated agricultural knowledge that was vital to the survival of ancient farming communities. The story encodes information about soil fertility, the importance of letting fields lie fallow, the timing of planting and harvest, and even the nutritional value of different seeds. Persephone's consumption of pomegranate seeds in the underworld, reflects the ancient understanding that certain foods must be preserved through the winter months, while her return to the surface world signals the time for spring planting. The memory keepers also understood the importance of redundancy. The same essential knowledge would be encoded in multiple stories told from different perspectives, ensuring that if one narrative thread was broken, others would remain intact. The flood myths found in cultures across the globe, from Noah's Ark to the Epic of Gilgamesh, from Hindu accounts of Manu to Native American stories of world-cleansing waters, likely preserve collective memories of actual geological events, but they also encode practical knowledge about surviving catastrophic floods, building waterproof vessels, and preserving genetic diversity in both crops and livestock. In the Norse tradition, the myth of Ragnarok appears to describe an apocalyptic end to the world of the gods. But examined closely, this story contains sophisticated astronomical knowledge about the precession of the equinoxes, the cyclical nature of ice ages, and the relationship between solar activity and climate change. The image of Fenrir the wolf swallowing the sun may preserve ancient observations of solar eclipses or solar minimum periods that corresponded with harsh winters and crop failures. The memory keepers were not primitive people telling simple stories around campfires. They were the intellectual elite of their societies, trained from childhood in the arts of encoding and preserving knowledge. They understood that their role was nothing less than ensuring the survival of their civilization's accumulated wisdom. They developed elaborate mnemonic systems using rhythm, rhyme, and repetition to make their stories unforgettable. They created complex networks of cross-references, where characters and events in one story would connect to others, creating a vast web of interconnected knowledge. The training of these memory keepers was intensive and often secretive. In many cultures, the full versions of the most important stories were revealed only to initiates who had proven their worthiness and demonstrated their ability to preserve the knowledge accurately. The ancient Celtic Druids, for instance, were said to require 20 years of training to master their oral traditions. This was not because the stories themselves were difficult to remember, but because understanding their true meaning, decoding the knowledge they contained, required extensive education in astronomy, medicine, law, and natural philosophy. As we drift deeper into sleep, we can imagine ourselves sitting beside these ancient fires, listening to voices that carried within them the wisdom of ages. The memory keepers knew that their stories would outlive their civilizations, that long after their temples crumbled and their cities were swallowed by sand, their encoded knowledge would survive in the collective unconscious of humanity, waiting for those with eyes to see and ears to hear to rediscover the treasures hidden within. Above the ancient world, the same stars that shine tonight once spelled out messages in a language that our ancestors could read as clearly as we read the words on a page. The celestial sphere was their first book, written in light and shadow, in the eternal dance of planets and constellations that mark the passage of time and the changing seasons. Within the myths of star-crossed lovers and celestial battles, the ancient astronomers preserved sophisticated knowledge of the cosmos that would not be formally rediscovered by European science until the Renaissance. The myth of Orion, the great hunter who was placed among the stars, appears in cultures across the globe, from ancient Egypt to Aboriginal Australia to the Lakota of North America. But these stories are far more than simple tales of heroic figures elevated to the heavens. They encode precise astronomical information about the constellation's movement through the night sky, its seasonal visibility, and its relationship to other celestial objects. The story of Orion pursuing the Seven Sisters, the Pleiades, preserves ancient observations about the proper motion of stars. The fact that celestial objects slowly change their positions relative to each other over vast periods of time. In the Polynesian tradition, the myth of Maui fishing up islands from the ocean floor contains remarkably accurate information about navigation by the stars. The story describes how Maui used his magical fish hook, which corresponds to the constellation Scorpius, to pull land from beneath the waves. For the Polynesian navigators who settled the vast Pacific, this myth served as a mnemonic device for remembering how to use the constellation Scorpius to determine their position at sea and find their way to distant islands. The rising and setting positions of various stars provided a celestial compass that allowed these ancient mariners to traverse thousands of miles of open ocean with extraordinary precision. The Greek myth of Phaethon, the son of Helios who stole his father's chariot and nearly destroyed the Earth by driving the sun too close to the ground, appears to preserve ancient observations of a cometary impact or major meteor shower. The story describes how Zeus had to strike down Phaethon with a thunderbolt to prevent global catastrophe, causing the reckless youth to fall into the river Eridanus. Modern astronomers have identified the Eridanus constellation as pointing toward the radiant of several meteor showers, suggesting that this myth may encode eyewitness accounts of spectacular celestial events that our ancestors feared might herald the end of the world. The ancient Mayans developed one of the most sophisticated astronomical systems in human history, and their mythology reflects this deep understanding of celestial mechanics. The Popol Vuh, the creation epic, describes the cosmic ball game played by the hero twins in the underworld. This story encodes precise information about the synodic period of Venus, the planet's alternating appearances as morning and evening star, and its relationship to the agricultural calendar. The ball game itself represents the apparent motion of Venus as it rises and sets at different points on the horizon throughout its 584-day cycle. The Chinese myth of Chang'e, the moon goddess who stole the elixir of immortality and fled to the lunar surface, preserves ancient understanding of the moon's phases and its relationship to the tides. The story describes how Chang'e's husband, the archer Hu Yi, shot down 9 of the 10 suns that were scorching the earth, leaving only one to provide light and warmth. This narrative encodes observations about solar activity, sunspot cycles, and the relationship between solar radiation and climate. The 10 suns may represent the ancient Chinese understanding of the 11-year solar cycle, with 9 representing the maximum number of major sunspot groups typically visible during solar maximum. In the Hindu tradition, the myth of the churning of the ocean of milk describes how the gods and demons work together to extract the nectar of immortality from the cosmic sea. This story contains sophisticated astronomical knowledge about the precession of the equinoxes, the 25,920-year cycle, during which the Earth's axis slowly wobbles like a spinning top. The cosmic serpent Vasuki, used as a rope to turn Mount Mandara and churn the ocean, represents the ecliptic, while the mountain itself symbolises the axis of the world. The various treasures that emerge from the churning correspond to different stars and constellations that become visible as the Earth's axial precession slowly shifts our view of the night sky. The ancient Egyptians embedded remarkably precise astronomical knowledge in their mythology surrounding the journey of Ra through the underworld. The 12 hours of night, during which the sun god travels through the Duat to be reborn at dawn, correspond to the 12 houses of the zodiac. But more than this, the various demons and challenges that Ra faces in each hour encode information about stellar positions, the timing of heliacal risings, and the relationship between celestial events and earthly phenomena. The myth of Set dismembering Osiris and scattering his body parts across Egypt preserves knowledge about the constellation Orion, which the Egyptians identified with Osiris, and its relationship to the flooding of the Nile. The Norse myth of the wolf Fenrir, eventually devouring Odin at Ragnarok, appears to encode ancient observations of solar eclipses and the understanding that these events follow predictable patterns. The binding of Fenrir with the magical chain Gleipnir represents the mathematical relationship that allows eclipses to be predicted. The wolf is constrained by invisible forces that determine when and where it will be able to devour the sun. The myth also preserves knowledge about the Saros cycle, the 18-year 11-day period after which solar and lunar eclipses repeat in similar patterns. Perhaps most remarkably, the global prevalence of dragon myths may preserve collective memories of cometary apparitions and meteor showers. The description of dragons as serpentine creatures with bright, fiery breath that arc across the sky matches eyewitness accounts of large meteors or comets. The Chinese Zhuan, which brings both destruction and renewal, embodies the ancient understanding that while celestial visitors could herald catastrophe, they also brought the essential elements needed for life. Modern spectroscopy has confirmed that comets and meteorites indeed contain water, organic compounds, and other materials that may have been crucial to the development of life on Earth. The star knowledge embedded in myths served practical purposes that extended far beyond mere timekeeping. Ancient farmers used mythological calendars to determine optimal planting and harvesting times. The rising of certain constellations signalled when to expect floods, when to migrate to new hunting grounds, when to begin or end religious festivals. The myth of Persephone's return from the underworld didn't just explain the coming of spring, it provided farmers with a precise astronomical marker for when soil temperatures and day length would be optimal for sowing seeds. As we allow these ancient star stories to wash over us like gentle waves, we can feel ourselves connecting to that primal human need to find meaning in the patterns of light above us. The memory keepers who created these myths understood that we are not separate from the cosmos, but intimately connected to its rhythms and cycles. They encoded this understanding in stories that would survive long after their instruments had rusted away and their observatories had crumbled to dust. In the quiet darkness of approaching sleep, we can sense the same stars that guided our ancestors still wheeling overhead, carrying their eternal messages for those who remember how to read the ancient language written in light. In the time before medical schools and pharmaceutical laboratories, when the distinction between magic and medicine had not yet been drawn, healers preserved their knowledge through stories that seemed to speak of gods and monsters, of miraculous transformations and supernatural cures. Yet within these mythical narratives lay sophisticated understanding of anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, and psychology that would not be formally recognized by the modern science for thousands of years. The healing stories were vessels carrying precious cargo across the dark sea of ignorance, ensuring that life-saving knowledge would survive even when its rational explanations were lost. The Greek myth of Asclepius, the divine physician who could raise the dead, encodes a comprehensive system of ancient medicine that was practiced in healing temples throughout the Mediterranean world. The story tells of how Asclepius learned the art of healing from Chiron the centaur, who taught him to use herbs, perform surgery, and understand the deeper connections between mind and body. But the myth also preserves specific medical knowledge. Asclepius's staff, entwined with a serpent, represents the spinal cord and nervous system, while the serpent itself symbolizes the regenerative power of life force that ancient healers learned to direct through their patients' bodies. The temples of Asclepius, known as Asclepia, functioned as the world's first hospitals, where patients underwent what we would now recognize as a sophisticated form of psychosomatic medicine. The myth describes how patients would sleep in the temple and receive healing dreams from the god. In reality, the priests had developed an elaborate system of dream therapy, using controlled environments, suggestion, herbs, and psychological techniques to induce healing states. The stories told to patients before they slept were carefully crafted to trigger specific psychological and physiological responses that promoted recovery. The Hindu myth of Dhanvantari, the divine physician who emerged from the churning of the cosmic ocean carrying the nectar of immortality, preserves the foundational principles of Ayurvedic medicine. The story describes how Dhanvantari appeared with 4 hands, carrying a conch shell, a discus, a leech, and a pot of amrita. Each of these symbols encodes medical knowledge. The conch represents the importance of sound therapy and mantras in healing. The discus symbolizes the cyclical nature of health and disease, the leech indicates the practice of bloodletting and detoxification, and the pot of amrita represents the alchemical preparation of medicines that could restore vitality and longevity. The myth also preserves understanding of the 3 doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, the fundamental energies that Ayurvedic medicine recognizes as governing all physiological processes. These concepts are embedded in stories about the cosmic forces that shape creation, the interactions between different deities, and the seasonal cycles that affect human health. The ancient physicians who developed these ideas understood that the human body is a microcosm of the universe, subject to the same fundamental forces that govern the movement of stars and the changing of seasons. The Chinese myth of Shennong, the divine farmer who tasted hundreds of herbs to discover their medicinal properties, encodes the foundational knowledge of traditional Chinese medicine. The story tells of how Shennong had a transparent stomach that allowed him to observe the effects of different plants on his internal organs, and how he was poisoned dozens of times in his quest to catalogue the healing properties of the natural world. This myth preserves not only specific information about herbal remedies, but also the systematic approach to pharmacological research that Chinese medicine developed thousands of years before the scientific method was formally articulated. The myth of Shennong also encodes understanding of the 5 elements theory and the meridian system that forms the basis of acupuncture. The story describes how the divine farmer taught humans to cultivate not only plants, but also the internal energy called qi that flows through the body along specific pathways. The techniques for manipulating this energy through needles, herbs, massage and meditation were preserved in stories about immortal sages who could control the forces of nature and achieve extraordinary longevity. In the Americas, the myth of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who brought knowledge and civilization to humanity, contains sophisticated understanding of psychoactive plants and their use in healing ceremonies. The story describes how Quetzalcoatl taught humans to use various plants for spiritual purification and physical healing, but warned that these powerful medicines must be used with proper respect and understanding. The myth encodes specific information about dosages, preparation methods, and the psychological techniques needed to guide patients through transformative healing experiences. The feathered serpent itself represents the union of earthly and celestial wisdom, the serpent symbolizing the kundalini energy that lies coiled at the base of the spine, while the feathers represent the elevated consciousness that can be achieved through proper use of plant medicines. The myth preserves understanding of what modern neuroscience recognizes as neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize and heal itself through specific types of profound experiences. The Celtic myth of the Dagda's cauldron, which could provide inexhaustible nourishment and bring the dead back to life, encodes ancient knowledge about nutrition, fermentation, and the preparation of healing broths and tinctures. The story describes how the cauldron would never empty when feeding the righteous, but would provide nothing for the wicked. This apparent moral judgment actually preserves understanding of how certain foods and medicines work differently depending on the physical and psychological state of the patient. The myth also encodes knowledge about what we now call personalized medicine, the understanding that the same treatment may have vastly different effects on different individuals depending on their constitution, lifestyle, and spiritual condition. The Celtic healers understood that true healing required not just the right medicine, but also the right relationship between healer and patient, the right spiritual context, and the right understanding of the patient's place in the larger web of life. The Norse myth of Idun's apples, which granted immortality to the gods, preserves ancient knowledge about antioxidants, phytonutrients, and the relationship between diet and longevity. The story tells of how the goddess Idun was kidnapped by giants, causing the gods to rapidly age until she was rescued, and her magical apples were once again available. This myth encodes understanding of how certain compounds found in fruits and plants can slow the aging process and protect against degenerative diseases. The ancient healers who created these myths understood that the most powerful medicine was often the story itself. They recognized what modern psychology calls the placebo effect, the ability of belief and expectation to trigger real physiological changes in the body. But they went deeper than this, understanding that healing stories could reprogram the unconscious mind, helping patients to visualize and embody states of wholeness and vitality. The shamanic traditions of Siberia preserve healing myths that describe journeys to other worlds to retrieve lost soul parts or negotiate with diseased spirits. These stories encode sophisticated psychological techniques for treating what we now recognize as trauma, dissociation, and psychosomatic illness. The The shamans understood that many diseases begin in the realm of consciousness and that healing often requires narrative reconstruction, helping patients to tell new stories about their lives and their relationship to illness and health. The Aboriginal Australian healing stories describe how ancestral beings sang the world into existence, and how contemporary healers can use similar songs to restore harmony to bodies and minds that have fallen out of tune with the universal rhythm. These myths preserve the understanding of sound therapy, vibrational medicine, and the profound effects that music and chanting can have on the nervous system and immune function. As we sink deeper into the healing embrace of sleep, we can feel these ancient stories working their subtle magic within us, reconnecting us to the timeless wisdom of the body's ability to heal itself. The memory keepers who preserved these healing myths understood that every story has the power to transform the listener, that the very act of hearing about healing can begin the process of restoration and renewal. In the quiet darkness of the approaching night, we become both patient and healer, allowing the ancient medicine stories to work their gentle transformations within our dreams. The sacred geometries that had once guided temple builders across continents, their measurements encoding frequencies that could alter consciousness itself. These patterns, woven into creation stories like golden threads through dark cloth, spoke of mathematical truths that modern minds struggle to comprehend, their precision suggesting knowledge systems far more sophisticated than orthodox history dares acknowledge. Across the vast expanse of human storytelling, from the emerald jungles of Mesoamerica to the windswept steppes of Central Asia, the serpent emerges as keeper of forbidden knowledge, its sinuous form carrying wisdom too dangerous for ordinary minds to possess. In the shadow of the Great Pyramid at Chichen Itza, where equinox light creates the illusion of Kukulkan's descent, archaeologists have uncovered acoustic chambers that resonate at frequencies matching those described in ancient texts as capable of inducing trance states. The feathered serpent, they whisper, was not merely a god but a technology, a means of accessing altered consciousness through sound and geometry. The Mayan codices, those few precious books that survived the conquistadors' fires, speak of the Itzamna, the creator deity often depicted with serpentine attributes, who gave humanity the gift of writing, calendar making, and medicine. But hidden within the glyphs lies something more profound, references to time windows and dimensional doorways that suggest the Maya understood reality as far more malleable than we believe possible. Their long count calendar, with its intricate cycles within cycles, appears designed not merely to track time, but to predict moments when the fabric of existence grows thin, when other worlds bleed through into our own. In the Amazon basin, among the Shipibo people, ayahuasquera still sing the Icaros, healing songs that they claim were taught to them directly by the serpent spirits that inhabit the vine. These shamans describe a reality layered like onion skin, where each peel reveals new dimensions of existence. The geometric patterns they paint and weave, impossibly complex fractals that seem to pulse with their own life, are said to be visual representations of the songs themselves, maps of consciousness that guide souls through realms invisible to ordinary sight. Scientists studying these patterns have discovered they match the mathematical structures found in quantum mechanics, suggesting these indigenous healers may have preserved understanding of reality's deepest architecture. The serpent's wisdom extends beyond shamanic traditions into the very foundations of human knowledge. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerian god Enki, lord of fresh water and wisdom, was often depicted with serpents flowing from his shoulders like living rivers. The tablets tell of how Enki defied the other gods to give humanity the gift of consciousness, warning our ancestors of the great flood through whispered dreams. But buried within these stories lies something more. Descriptions of genetic manipulation, of the breath of life being carefully woven into human clay through processes that sound remarkably like modern descriptions of DNA alteration. The double helix itself, that spiral staircase of genetic information, finds its mirror in countless mythological traditions. The caduceus of Hermes, with its twin serpents wrapped around a central staff, appears in medical traditions worldwide long before microscopes revealed the structure of our cellular blueprints. Hindu texts describe the Kundalini, a serpent of consciousness coiled at the base of the spine, which when awakened rises through 7 chakras, energy centers that correspond precisely to the locations of major neural and endocrine clusters in the human body. This ancient understanding of the body's energetic architecture, dismissed by modern medicine as primitive superstition, is being rediscovered through quantum biology and the study of biophotons. In the mist-shrouded islands of the Pacific, where ancient Polynesian navigators once read the ocean's subtle language with supernatural precision, lies encoded within their creation myths an understanding of water's true nature that modern science is only beginning to glimpse. The Maori speak of Tankroa, god of the sea, whose memory flows through every drop, carrying the songs of whales across vast distances, encoding information in molecular structures that persist across millennia. Their navigation techniques passed down through oral tradition for over 3,000 years suggest knowledge of oceanic patterns and magnetic fields that conventional geography cannot explain. The navigators, known as wayfinders, describe reading the swell patterns created by islands hundreds of miles away, sensing the presence of land through changes in watercolour, bird behaviour, and cloud formations that speak of deep ocean currents carrying information across the planet's vast blue highways. But embedded within their training songs lie references to water memory, the belief that ocean holds the imprint of every interaction, every passage, every sacred ceremony performed upon its surface. Modern research into water's molecular structure reveals it forms clusters that can indeed hold information patterns, suggesting these ancient navigators understood something about liquid consciousness that we are only beginning to rediscover. In the sacred pools of Celtic Ireland, where druids once performed their most secret rituals, local folklore speaks of wells that could reveal the future to those who knew how to read the patterns in their depths. These holy wells, scattered across the landscape like acupuncture points on the Earth's body, were believed to be connected by underground streams that carried messages between the worlds of the living and the dead. Archaeological investigation reveals these sites are often located at points where underground water systems converge, creating electromagnetic anomalies that sensitive individuals claim allow glimpses into other dimensions of time and space. The Hindu tradition of Ganga, the sacred river goddess, embodies this understanding of water as divine consciousness flowing through the landscape. Pilgrims travel thousands of miles to bathe in the Ganges, believing its waters can wash away not just physical impurities, but karmic debts accumulated across lifetimes. The river is described in ancient texts as having descended from the heavens, its celestial origins encoding it with properties that transcend ordinary matter. Modern studies of Ganges water reveal unusual bacteriophage populations that can purify contaminated water, supporting claims of its healing properties, while suggesting the ancients understood biological processes we're still trying to map. Japanese Shinto traditions recognize water spirits called Mizuko, acknowledging every stream, pond and rainfall as possessing consciousness and memory. The practice of water blessing, where priests chant specific syllables over water samples, demonstrates measurable changes in the liquid's crystalline structure when frozen, patterns that reflect the emotional and spiritual content of the blessing. This understanding of water as a recording medium appears throughout global traditions. Aboriginal Australians speak of billabongs that hold the songs of the dreamtime, while Native American ceremonies honour water as the first medicine, carrying the prayers of all life forms back to the source of creation. The flood myths that appear in virtually every human culture may preserve memories not just of rising waters, but of humanity's relationship with a more conscious form of liquid existence. These stories speak of a time when water and humanity communicated directly, when rains came in response to ceremony and drought lifted through proper relationship with the aquatic realm. The global nature of these myths suggests they preserve real historical events encoded in symbolic language, perhaps memories of when human consciousness was more directly linked to the planet's hydrological cycles, when weather was not something that happened to us, but something we participated in creating through our collective awareness. Beneath the towering megaliths of Stonehenge, where archaeologists have discovered acoustic properties that amplify and focus sound in ways that transform human consciousness, lies embedded within the landscape itself a technology that speaks directly to the soul through frequencies older than written language. The massive trilithons, positioned with astronomical precision that rivals modern observatories, create standing wave patterns that resonate at the same frequency as human brain states associated with deep meditation and expanded awareness. Recent sound analysis reveals the entire structure functions as a massive resonance chamber, suggesting its builders understood principles of harmonic architecture that we are only beginning to rediscover. The Welsh legends speak of Myrddin, whom later traditions would call Merlin, commanding the great stones to dance across the landscape, their movement accompanied by music that could heal the sick and raise the dead. But encoded within these fantastical tales lies a more profound truth: descriptions of acoustic levitation, of sound frequencies that could overcome gravitational forces and move massive objects through pure vibrational manipulation. The massive blue stones, transported from Welsh quarries over 150 miles away, show evidence of precise acoustic tuning, each one calibrated to produce specific tones when struck, suggesting the entire monument was designed as a giant musical instrument capable of generating healing frequencies. Similar acoustic properties have been discovered at megalithic sites worldwide, from the Great Passage Tomb at Newgrange in Ireland, where the inner chamber resonates at precisely 110 Hz, a frequency that affects human consciousness by shifting brainwave patterns toward theta states associated with deep dreaming and spiritual visions, to the temple complexes of Malta, where oracle chambers amplify the human voice into supernatural pronouncements that seem to emerge from the stone itself. These discoveries suggest a global network of acoustic temples, each one designed to facilitate specific states of consciousness through architectural manipulation of sound and space. In the Andes Mountains, where the massive stones of Sacsayhuaman fit together with joints so precise that not even a knife blade can slip between them, Quechua oral traditions describe the builders as masters of Aini, a concept of reciprocal relationship that extends beyond human interaction to include communion with the mineral realm itself. The legends speak of priests who could sing to stone, softening granite and basalt through vocal harmonics that works at the molecular level, allowing massive blocks to be shaped like clay and fitted together through sound-based technologies that left no tool marks. Modern analysis of the stonework reveals evidence of thermal alteration at joint interfaces, suggesting these blocks were indeed subjected to some form of energy that could temporarily alter their crystalline structure. The Aboriginal Australian tradition of songlines maps the entire continent as a musical score, with each landmark, water source and sacred site corresponding to verses in an epic song that describes the creation of the landscape itself. These ancestral tracks, sung into existence by the Dreamtime beings, are said to maintain the physical world through continuous vocal recognition. The land exists because it is constantly being sung into being by those who know its true names. When traditional custodians die without passing on their songs, the sites they maintained are believed to literally fade from existence, suggesting a form of reality maintenance through acoustic acknowledgement that modern physics is beginning to understand through studies of the observer effect and consciousness-matter interaction. The great cathedral builders of medieval Europe encoded similar understanding into their sacred architecture, designing spaces where specific chants and hymns would create standing wave patterns that induce mystical experiences in the faithful. The Gothic arches, rose windows, and acoustic properties of spaces like Chartres Cathedral demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of how architectural form can modulate consciousness through harmonic resonance. Hidden within the geometric proportions of these sacred spaces lie mathematical relationships based on musical intervals, suggesting the builders understood reality itself as fundamentally musical in nature, with matter as crystallized sound and architecture as a means of creating spaces where heaven and earth could commune through pure harmony. In the lamplit chambers beneath the great library of Alexandria, where scholars once gathered the wisdom of the world into scrolls that held the collected knowledge of human civilization, there worked in secret the keepers of names, scribes and mystics who understood that words themselves were not mere symbols, but living entities capable of reshaping reality through their proper invocation. These guardians of linguistic power preserved within their manuscripts the understanding that language originated not as human invention, but as divine technology, each syllable carrying frequencies that could unlock doors between dimensions, summon healing energies, or call forth the fundamental forces that govern existence itself. The ancient Egyptian tradition of hieroglyphic writing demonstrates this profound relationship between symbol and reality, where each glyph functions simultaneously as letter, word, or a magical formula. The scribes who carved these sacred texts into temple walls understood themselves as architects of reality, the careful placement of each symbol creating energetic patterns that would continue to influence the world for millennia. The hieroglyph for life, the Ankh, appears in context suggesting it was not merely a symbol, but an actual key, a specific combination of curves and angles that could unlock vital energies when properly drawn, spoken, or visualized. Modern analysis of Sanskrit reveals mathematical properties that suggest this ancient language was engineered rather than evolved, its grammar and phonetic structure following principles that optimize information transmission and consciousness manipulation. The Vedic tradition speaks of the universe itself as emerging from primordial sound, the cosmic Om, and describes reality as composed of successive layers of vibration that crystallize into matter through the organizing power of sacred syllables. The mantras preserved in these texts are said to be not prayers, but technologies, specific sound sequences that can reprogram the practitioner's awareness and facilitate direct interaction with the quantum field that underlies physical existence. In the mystical traditions of Judaism, the Hebrew alphabet is understood as containing the fundamental building blocks of creation itself, each letter representing both a sound and a cosmic principle. The Kabbalistic practice of gematria reveals numerical relationships between words that suggest language, operates according to mathematical laws more fundamental than mere communication. The tradition speaks of the lost pronunciation of the divine name, YHVH, knowledge of which would grant the speaker power over the material world itself. This missing knowledge, hidden within the oral tradition and passed down through initiatory lineages, represents technology disguised as theology, practical applications of acoustic engineering encoded within religious practice. The Celtic Druids, whose training required 20 years of memorizing sacred texts without ever committing them to writing, understood the spoken word as carrying power that written symbols could not contain. Their oral tradition preserved not just stories but actual vocal techniques, specific breathing patterns, tonal modulations, and rhythmic cadences that could induce trance states, facilitate healing, or establish communication with non-human intelligences. The Irish concept of true speech, words that cannot lie because they align perfectly with the vibrational signature of reality itself, suggests these ancient priests possessed techniques for calibrating language to match the fundamental frequencies of existence. The Tibetan tradition of mantra and dharani preserves perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of language as technology, with specific syllable combinations designed to activate different aspects of consciousness and redirect the flow of life energy through the practitioner's subtle body. The practice of seed syllables, single sounds that contain entire universes of meaning and power, demonstrates understanding of how acoustic resonance can access and modify the quantum templates that underlie physical manifestation. These practices, preserved within monastic lineages for over 1,000 years, are being rediscovered by Ruvio and researchers studying the effects of specific sound frequencies on cellular regeneration and genetic expression. The preservation of these linguistic technologies within mythological traditions worldwide suggests that what we interpret as primitive superstition may actually represent the remnants of an advanced civilization's knowledge encoded in symbolic language to survive periods of cultural collapse and intentional suppression. The recurring themes of words of power, true names, and songs of creation that appear across unconnected cultures point toward a lost science of consciousness that understood language not as description, but as the fundamental creative force of the universe itself, each properly spoken word a tool for reshaping reality at its most basic level. Across the windswept highlands of Peru, where the descendants of the Inca still weave textiles using patterns passed down through countless generations, each thread carries within its placement not merely aesthetic beauty, but encoded information about the nature of time itself. The ancient understanding that past, present, and future exist simultaneously in the eternal now, accessible to those who know how to read the language of thread and colour, knot and space. The quipu, those mysterious knotted record-keeping devices that the conquistadors dismissed as primitive accounting tools, are being revealed through modern analysis to contain mathematical complexities that rival computer programming languages, their three-dimensional information storage suggesting the Inca possessed data management systems more sophisticated than anything in the European world of their time. The Andean concept of Eni extends beyond reciprocity between humans to encompass relationship with time itself, the understanding that temporal threads can be woven together through proper ceremony and intention, allowing communication across generations and access to wisdom from ancestors who exist not in a distant past, but in a parallel present that intersects with our own at sacred moments. The textiles woven by master weavers in these traditions contain patterns that serve as maps of this temporal landscape, each geometric design representing pathways through time that can be traversed by those who understand the codes embedded within the cloth. Similar understanding appears in the Celtic tradition of the Morrigan, the triple goddess whose loom weaves the fates of warriors and nations, her shuttle carrying threads of destiny that connect moments across centuries. The Celtic knotwork that adorns their sacred manuscripts demonstrates mathematical principles that modern topology is only beginning to understand, with patterns that loop back upon themselves in ways that suggest time as circular rather than linear, each moment connected to every other moment through pathways that the initiated could learn to navigate. The Irish annals speak of druids who could walk between times, visiting past and future events as easily as travelling from one hill to another. In the creation myths of the Hopi people, time is described as a spiral staircase where each level represents a different world age, with humanity currently ascending from the third world to the fourth through a process of collective spiritual evolution. Their prophecies, carved into rock faces throughout the American Southwest, describe future events with startling accuracy, suggesting access to information that transcends linear causation. The Hopi understanding of time as prophecy, the future reaching back to inform the present, offers a model of temporal mechanics that quantum physics is beginning to validate through studies of retrocausality and the time symmetry of fundamental equations. The Norse tradition of the Norns, three sisters who sit beside the Well of Erd spinning the threads of fate, preserves knowledge of time as a weavable medium, with past, present and future existing as accessible dimensions of a single temporal fabric. The practice of Seda, the shamanic tradition associated with these deities, involved techniques for accessing information from across the timeline, allowing practitioners to see outcomes of present actions and modify them through ritual intervention. The concept of weird, often translated as fate but more accurately understood as the living web of causation that connects all events, suggests understanding of reality as a network where changes in one location ripple across space and time to influence seemingly unrelated occurrences. Modern physics is beginning to validate these ancient models through discoveries about the nature of space-time itself, revealing that Einstein's block universe, where past, present and future exist simultaneously, matches the temporal understanding preserved in mystical traditions worldwide. The growing field of consciousness studies suggests that awareness itself may operate outside conventional temporal constraints, capable of accessing information from across the timeline through mechanisms that orthodox science is still struggling to explain. These discoveries lend credibility to the possibility that ancient cultures possessed practical techniques for temporal navigation, technologies disguised as mythology that await rediscovery by minds capable of thinking beyond the limitations of linear time. The implications of these preserved temporal technologies extend far beyond historical curiosity, suggesting that human consciousness may be far more powerful and capable than modern materialism allows, that the boundaries between past, present, and future may be permeable to properly trained awareness, and that the wisdom traditions of indigenous cultures worldwide may contain practical knowledge for navigating reality's deeper dimensions. As the threads of ancient understanding begin to weave themselves into the fabric of contemporary knowledge, we may discover that our ancestors were not primitive people struggling to explain natural phenomena, but sophisticated beings who understood aspects of existence that we are only beginning to remember. The serpent coiled around the world tree, its scales catching starlight that had travelled eons to reach this moment of telling. In the Norse halls where mead flowed like liquid amber and the fire crackled with ancient authority, the skalds wove stories that carried within them the very architecture of existence itself. They spoke of Yggdrasil, the world tree, whose roots delved deep into the wells of wisdom, and whose branches supported the 9 realms of being. But beneath the surface of these tales lay truths that the modern world had forgotten, cosmic principles that ancient peoples understood not through telescopes or equations, but through the deep listening that comes when one sits with mystery long enough to hear it speak. The Eddas, those great collections of Norse wisdom, were never meant to be mere entertainment around the hearthfire. They were instruction manuals for a cosmology so sophisticated that even today's physicists find themselves returning to concepts that the ancient northern peoples embedded in their mythological framework. The idea of multiple dimensions existing simultaneously, of time as a fluid rather than linear concept, of the universe as a living organism rather than a mechanical construct. All of these notions lived within the stories of gods and giants, of ravens and wolves, of the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that the Norsemen called Ragnarok. Consider the Well of Erd, where the Norns, those weavers of fate, tended the roots of the world tree. Quantum physicists speak of probability waves and the observer effect, of how the act of measurement itself changes the nature of reality. The ancient Norse understood this principle through the image of 3 sisters weaving the threads of destiny, constantly adjusting the pattern based on choices made and unmade. Erd represented the past, Verdandi the present, and Skuld the future. But these were not separate entities. They were aspects of a single consciousness that operated outside the linear flow of time as humans typically experience it. The myth spoke of Odin hanging himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, piercing himself with his own spear, sacrificing himself to himself in order to gain knowledge of the runes. This was not a story about a god's masochistic tendencies, but rather a profound teaching about the nature of consciousness and the price of deep knowledge. The shamanic traditions from which these stories emerged understood that true wisdom could only be gained through a kind of death. The death of the ordinary mind, the death of conventional perception, the death of the ego that keeps us trapped in surface-level understanding. The runes themselves were never merely an alphabet. They were a technology of consciousness, a way of interfacing with the deeper patterns that govern reality. Each rune was both a sound and a symbol, both a concept and a force, both a key and a door. The ancient practitioners understood that language itself was a form of magic, that sounds and symbols could alter the fabric of existence when used with proper knowledge and intent. This understanding has been preserved in fragments within various mystical traditions, but the complete system, the full technology of runic consciousness, was lost when the old ways were forcibly replaced by newer religious paradigms. Along the banks of the Nile, where the annual flood brought both destruction and renewal, the ancient Egyptians developed a mythology that encoded their profound understanding of consciousness, death, and the journey of the soul through various states of being. The stories of Osiris, Isis, and Horus were not primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena, but rather sophisticated maps of psychological and spiritual transformation that modern depth psychology is only beginning to rediscover. The myth of Osiris, murdered by his brother Set, dismembered and scattered across the land, then reassembled and resurrected by his wife Isis, represents one of humanity's most complete teachings about the process of individuation, the journey from unconscious wholeness through conscious separation to integrated wisdom. Carl Jung spent decades trying to articulate what the ancient Egyptians had already encoded in a single story cycle: the necessary dismemberment of the ego, the dark night of the soul, and the eventual resurrection into a more complete form of consciousness. But the Egyptian mysteries went deeper than individual psychology. They understood principles of consciousness that extend far beyond the personal into the cosmic realm. The concept of Ma'at, often simplified as merely truth or justice, was actually a sophisticated understanding of cosmic balance, of the fundamental principle that maintains harmony throughout the universe. Ma'at was both a goddess and a principle, both a person and a process, both a being and a way of being. She represented the underlying order that keeps the stars in their courses and the seasons in their cycles, but also the moral order that connects individual actions to cosmic consequences. The weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at, depicted so often in Egyptian art, was not a primitive moral teaching, but a precise description of how consciousness evaluates itself after death. The heart, understood as the seat of both emotion and intelligence, was weighed against the principle of cosmic balance. If the heart was heavier than the feather, if it carried the weight of actions taken in disharmony with universal principles, then the soul could not proceed to the next stage of existence. This was not punishment, but natural law, as inevitable as gravity and as impersonal as mathematics. The Egyptian understanding of death was perhaps their greatest contribution to human knowledge, and also the teaching that has been most thoroughly lost. They understood death not as an ending, but as a transformation. Not as a destination, but as a journey. Not as a singular event, but as a process that could be navigated with skill and preparation. The elaborate funeral preparations, the mummification processes, the detailed maps of the afterlife contained in texts like the Book of the Dead, all of these were practical technologies for consciousness, methods for maintaining awareness and identity through the transition from physical to non-physical existence. The pyramids themselves were not monuments to ego or displays of royal power, but rather sophisticated machines for facilitating consciousness transformation. Their precise mathematical relationships, their alignment with celestial bodies, their internal chambers and passages, all of these features were designed to create specific effects on human consciousness. Recent research has shown that the acoustics within the Great Pyramid create sound frequencies that induce altered states of consciousness, that the geometric proportions embody mathematical relationships found throughout nature, that the entire structure functions as a kind of consciousness amplifier. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Egyptian wisdom was their understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear. The myth of the eternal return of cosmic cycles that repeat endlessly but with variations allowed them to see patterns that extend far beyond individual lifetimes. They understood that consciousness itself follows cyclical patterns, that civilizations rise and fall, that knowledge is gained and lost and regained, that the same essential dramas play out on different stages throughout history. This understanding gave them a perspective that transcended the limitations of any single era or culture. In the olive groves and marble temples of ancient Greece, where philosophy was born from the marriage of myth and reason, the old stories carried forward wisdom traditions that stretched back to the very dawn of human consciousness. The Greeks inherited fragments of knowledge from the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the mysterious sea peoples, and sources even more ancient. But they transformed these inherited wisdoms through their unique genius for synthesis, creating mythological narratives that wove together cosmology, psychology, ethics, and metaphysics into seamless wholes. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice encoded teachings about the nature of love, death and of his power of consciousness to transcend the boundaries between worlds. Orpheus, whose music could charm stones and tame wild beasts, represented the human capacity to harmonize with the deeper rhythms of existence. His journey to the underworld to retrieve his beloved Eurydice was not merely a romantic tragedy, but a precise map of the soul's journey through death and potential rebirth. The prohibition against looking back, the condition placed on Eurydice's return, represented the necessity of complete faith and forward-moving intention when attempting to resurrect what has been lost. But Orpheus was more than a mythological figure. He was the supposed founder of the Orphic Mysteries, one of the most sophisticated spiritual traditions of the ancient world. The Orphic teachings, preserved in fragments and whispered initiations, taught that the soul was divine in nature but trapped in matter through a primordial fall. They developed elaborate practices for purifying the soul and returning it to its divine source. These teachings influenced Pythagoras, Plato, and eventually the early Christian theologians, but the complete Orphic system, with its emphasis on direct spiritual experience and the systematic transformation of consciousness, was lost when the mystery schools were finally suppressed. The myth of Prometheus bringing fire to humanity encoded the story of consciousness itself, how awareness came to be separated from its source, how knowledge always comes with a price, how the gift of self-reflection inevitably brings both power and suffering. Prometheus was not simply a rebel god who stole fire from Zeus. He was a representation of the principle of consciousness that allows beings to transcend their natural limitations. The fire he brought was not merely physical flame, but the fire of awareness itself, the spark of divinity that allows humans to participate in the creative process of the universe. The punishment of Prometheus, chained to a rock while an eagle eternally devoured his liver, represented the eternal tension between consciousness and the unconscious forces that seek to limit its expansion. The liver, in ancient understanding, was the seat of emotion and passion. The myth was teaching that consciousness, once awakened, must eternally struggle with the passionate, irrational forces within the psyche. But the story also contains hope. Prometheus's liver regenerated each night, suggesting that consciousness possesses an inexhaustible capacity for renewal, and that even the most severe limitations cannot ultimately destroy the divine spark within human nature. The Greek understanding of the psyche was far more sophisticated than modern translations suggest. When they spoke of the soul, they weren't referring to a simple spiritual essence, but to a complex, multi-layered structure of consciousness. They recognized different aspects of the soul: the nutritive soul that maintained physical life, the sensitive soul that enabled perception and emotion, and the rational soul that allowed for abstract thought and moral reasoning. But beyond these, in the teachings of Plato and the later Neoplatonists, was the recognition of nous, pure consciousness or spiritual intelligence that transcended individual identity. The Platonic myths, the allegory of the cave, the myth of the story of Atlantis, were not mere philosophical illustrations but compressed teachings about the nature of reality and consciousness. The cave allegory described the human condition, trapped in a world of shadows and reflections, mistaking appearance for reality, requiring a difficult journey upwards toward the light of true knowledge. But this was not merely metaphorical, it was a precise description of consciousness development, of the stages through which awareness must pass to achieve genuine understanding. The Greek mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries in particular, preserved ancient techniques for inducing direct spiritual experience. Initiates underwent elaborate preparations, including fasting, purification rituals, and the consumption of kykeon, a barley-based drink that likely contained psychoactive compounds. The climax of the initiation involved experiencing what the Greeks called a poptia, a direct vision of divine reality that transformed the initiate's understanding of life and death. Those who underwent this initiation were said to be no longer afraid of death, having directly experienced the continuity of consciousness beyond bodily existence. But perhaps the most profound Greek contribution to human understanding was their recognition that logos, often translated as word or reason, was the fundamental principle underlying all existence. This was not logos as human logic or language, but as the cosmic principle of order and meaning that gives structure to the universe. The Stoics understood that human reason was a participation in this cosmic logos, that individual consciousness was a fragment of universal consciousness, that the ultimate goal of philosophy was to align personal will with cosmic will. In the mist-shrouded forests of ancient Europe, where oak groves whispered secrets older than memory, and sacred springs bubbled with water that was said to carry the breath of the other world, the Celtic peoples developed a mythological tradition that preserved perhaps the most complete understanding of the relationship between consciousness and nature that has survived from the ancient world. Their stories, passed down through oral tradition by the Druids, and later recorded by Irish monks who recognised their profound spiritual value, contain teachings about the fluid boundaries between worlds, the sacred nature of the land itself, and the possibility of consciousness existing in forms far beyond the limitations of individual human identity. The Celtic otherworld was not a distant heaven or hell, but a parallel dimension that interpenetrated the physical world at every point. It could be accessed through various portals, sacred wells, ancient burial mounds, certain hills and groves, or even states of consciousness achieved through music, poetry, or ritual practice. This other world was inhabited by the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, who were not gods in the sense of distant supernatural beings, but rather representatives of consciousness in its various forms and functions. The story of the Dagda, with his magical cauldron that never emptied, and his club that could kill 9 men with one blow and restore them to life with the other end, encoded teachings about the fundamental creative and destructive forces of the universe. The Dagda was not merely a powerful deity, but a representation of the principle of abundance and regeneration that operates throughout nature. His cauldron represented the inexhaustible source from which all manifestation emerges, while his club represented the dual nature of power itself, capable of both destruction and creation, death and rebirth. The goddess Brigid, patroness of smithcraft, poetry and healing, represented the triple aspect of consciousness that the Celts understood to be fundamental to existence. She was simultaneously the fire of inspiration that enables artistic creation, the fire of transformation that allows for healing and smithcraft, and the fire of spirit that connects the individual soul to its divine source. The Celts understood that these were not separate functions but different aspects of a single principle, the creative fire of consciousness that manifests differently depending on the context in which it operates. The Druids themselves were the keepers of this ancient wisdom tradition. They underwent training that lasted up to 20 years, memorizing vast bodies of knowledge that included not only stories and poems but also astronomical calculations, botanical lore, legal precedents, and spiritual practices. They understood the interconnectedness of all knowledge, recognizing that astronomy and botany, law and spirituality, poetry and practical wisdom were all aspects of a single, unified understanding of how the universe operates. The Celtic concept of time was fundamentally different from the linear progression that characterizes modern Western thinking. They understood time as spiral rather than straight, with past, present and future interpenetrating each other in complex ways. This understanding was encoded in their festival calendar, which recognized certain times of year when the boundaries between worlds became thin and communication between different dimensions of reality became possible. Samhain, the festival that became Halloween, was understood as a time when the dead could communicate with the living, when prophecy became possible, when the patterns underlying existence became visible to those who knew how to look. The Irish concept of the Sidhe, the fairy mounds that dotted the landscape, represented a sophisticated understanding of sacred geography. These sites were not merely the homes of supernatural beings, but actual locations where the energy patterns of the earth created conditions favourable to expanded consciousness. Many of these sites have been validated by modern research as possessing unusual electromagnetic properties, acoustic characteristics, or astronomical alignments that could indeed affect human consciousness in measurable ways. The great Irish epic, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the Cattle Raid of Cooley, may appear on the surface to be simply a heroic tale of warfare and adventure, but embedded within its narrative structure are teachings about the nature of sovereignty, the relationship between individual will and cosmic law, and the process through which consciousness develops from its initial heroic phase through its mature integration with natural and divine principles. The hero Cuchulain's Rheastrad battle fury was not merely berserker rage, but a specific altered state of consciousness in which ordinary human limitations were transcended. The Celtic understanding of death was perhaps their most profound teaching. They recognised death not as an ending but as a transition, not as a journey to a distant realm but as a movement to a different layer of the same reality. Their myths speak of heroes and heroines who travel freely between the world of the living and the world of the dead, who carry knowledge and gifts from one realm to the other, who understand that consciousness itself is not bound by the limitations of physical existence. In the vast subcontinent of India, where the rivers Ganges and Saraswati carried the prayers of millions toward the distant sea, and where mountains touched the sky like stone fingers reaching toward the infinite, humanity developed what may be its most complete and systematic understanding of consciousness and its possibilities. The Hindu tradition, stretching back through millennia of oral transmission, before being committed to written form, preserved not merely stories about gods and heroes, but actual technologies of consciousness, precise methods for exploring and transforming human awareness that have been tested and refined through countless generations of practitioners. The Vedas, those ancient hymns that are among humanity's oldest literature, contain within their seemingly simple verses sophisticated understandings of cosmology, psychology, and metaphysics. The Rig Veda's famous creation hymn asks, "Who really knows? Who will here proclaim it? Whence was it produced? Whence is this creation?" The gods came afterwards, with the creation of this universe. Who then knows whence it has arisen? This is not primitive confusion about the origins of existence, but rather a profound recognition that ultimate reality transcends all conceptual categories and can only be approached through direct experience rather than intellectual analysis. The great epic of the Mahabharata, containing within it the philosophical teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, preserved wisdom about the nature of Dharma, the principle of cosmic order that manifests differently for each individual according to their particular nature and circumstances. The conversation between Arjuna and Krishna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra was not merely ethical advice about whether to fight in a particular war, but rather a complete teaching about how consciousness navigates the complexities of existence while maintaining alignment with universal principles. Krishna's teaching that one should act according to Dharma without attachment to the fruits of action represented a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual will and cosmic will. This was not passive fatalism, but rather active participation in the divine creative process, without the ego's demand for personal gain. The Gita taught that consciousness itself could be transformed through this practice of desireless action, that the individual self could gradually expand to encompass universal consciousness, while still maintaining its unique perspective and function. The Hindu understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear preserved ancient knowledge about the vast scales on which consciousness operates. The concept of yugas, cosmic ages that extend over millions of years, recognized that human consciousness itself evolves through enormous cycles of development, decline, and renewal. We are said to be currently in the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness, when spiritual knowledge becomes obscured and humanity loses touch with its divine nature. But this darkness is not permanent, it is followed by ages of increasing light and wisdom in an eternal cycle of cosmic breathing. The tradition of yoga, which means literally to yoke or to unite, developed as a systematic method for reuniting individual consciousness with its universal source. But yoga was never merely physical postures or breathing exercises. It was a complete science of consciousnesses that included ethical preparation, mental purification, physical practices, breath control, sensory withdrawal, concentration, meditation, and finally samadhi. The direct experience of unity with ultimate reality. The Hindu recognition of multiple layers or bodies of consciousness, physical, vital, mental, and spiritual, provided a map for understanding how awareness operates on different levels simultaneously. The physical body was understood to be merely the densest layer of a multidimensional system that extended from gross matter through subtle energy to pure consciousness itself. Practices were developed for working with each of these layers, for healing and transforming consciousness at every level of its manifestation. The concept of karma preserved ancient understanding about the relationship between action and consequence that extends far beyond simple moral cause and effect. Karma was understood as the principle by which consciousness creates its own experience through the quality of its attention and intention. Every thought, every emotion, every action created karmic traces that shaped future experience, but this was not deterministic fate, but rather the natural operation of consciousness in a responsive universe. The Hindu tradition also preserved perhaps humanity's most complete understanding of the divine feminine principle through its worship of the goddess in her various forms. Durga, Kali, Lakshmi, Saraswati, and countless other goddesses represented different aspects of Shakti, the creative power of consciousness that manifests the universe. This was not primitive goddess worship, but recognition that the creative principle of existence is fundamentally feminine in nature, that consciousness itself is both the witness and the power that creates what is witnessed. The practices of Tantra developed sophisticated methods for working with the feminine creative principle directly. Tantra recognized that ordinary consciousness, properly understood and skillfully worked with, was itself divine consciousness. Rather than trying to escape the world of form and sensation, tantric practices used form and sensation as vehicles for awakening to the divine nature of existence itself. This was perhaps the most radical understanding preserved in the Hindu tradition, that enlightenment was not transcendence of the human condition, but rather the full realization of what the human condition actually was. Along the great rivers of China, where the Yellow River carried the silt of millennia toward the sea, and where bamboo groves whispered in winds that had blown across the continent since before human memory, there emerged a tradition that preserved perhaps humanity's most practical and systematic understanding of how consciousness relates to the natural world. The Chinese approach to wisdom was never abstract or purely theoretical, but always rooted in careful observation of natural patterns and the development of methods for harmonizing human activity with the deeper rhythms of existence. The concept of the Tao, literally meaning the way, represented the Chinese understanding of the fundamental principle that underlies all existence. But the Tao was not a god or a philosophy, but rather the nameless source from which all named things emerge and to which they return. The opening lines of the Tao Te Ching state this clearly. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. This was recognition that ultimate reality transcends all conceptual categories while simultaneously being the source of all possible concepts. The teaching of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action, but better understood as effortless action, preserved ancient understanding about how consciousness can align itself with natural processes rather than working against them. Wu Wei was not passive inactivity, but rather action that emerges spontaneously from deep understanding of natural patterns. Like water flowing downhill, Wu Wei achieved maximum effect with minimum effort by working with rather than against the inherent tendencies of any situation. The Chinese understanding of yin and yang represented perhaps the most precise formulation of the fundamental polarity that operates throughout existence. But yin and yang were not opposing forces locked in eternal conflict. They were complementary aspects of a single underlying reality that manifested as duality only from limited perspectives. The famous yin-yang symbol, with its flowing curves and interpenetrating dots of opposite colour, encoded sophisticated teachings about how apparent opposites actually define and support each other. The I Ching, Qihong, or Book of Changes, preserved an ancient system for understanding the patterns through which the Tao manifests in the world of form. Based on combinations of broken and unbroken lines arranged in groups of 6, the I Ching describes 64 archetypal situations that consciousness encounters in its journey through existence. But this was not fortune-telling or divination in the superficial sense. It was a systematic method for understanding the underlying dynamics of any situation and aligning one's actions with the natural unfolding of events. The practice of Qigong developed methods for working directly with Qi, the fundamental life energy that flows through all living systems. Through specific movements, breathing patterns, and states of attention, Qigong practitioners learn to sense, direct, and refine this energy within their own bodies and in their relationship with the environment. This was not merely health practice, but actual energy cultivation that could eventually lead to extraordinary capacities of consciousness and perception. Traditional Chinese medicine preserved understanding of the human being as an energetic system embedded within and inseparable from the larger energetic patterns of nature. The meridian system, through which qi flows in the body, was understood to connect not only different organs and functions within the individual, but also to connect the individual with the seasonal, daily, and longer cycles of natural energy. Illness was understood not as random malfunction, but as disharmony between individual energy patterns and the larger patterns of natural flow. The Chinese tradition of landscape painting preserved a spiritual practice disguised as art. These paintings were not mere representations of natural scenery, but rather attempts to capture and transmit the spirit of particular places, what the Chinese called the life breath of mountains, rivers, and forests. The process of creating these paintings required the artist to enter into deep communion with the natural world, to become transparent to the essential nature of what was being painted, rather than imposing personal interpretation upon it. The concept of the mandate of heaven preserved ancient understanding about the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic order. Legitimate rule, according to this teaching, required alignment with the natural order of existence. A ruler who governed in harmony with the Tao would experience the support of natural forces, while one who ruled through personal ambition and against natural patterns would eventually face the withdrawal of the mandate and the collapse of their power. This was not merely political theory, but recognition that consciousness itself operates according to principles that cannot be violated without consequence. The Chinese understanding of death, influenced by both Taoist and Buddhist traditions, saw the transition from physical to non-physical existence as natural as the changing of seasons. The practices of internal alchemy developed methods for preparing consciousness for this transition, for maintaining awareness and identity through the dissolution of physical form. These practices recognized that death was not something that happened to consciousness, but rather something that consciousness could learn to navigate with skill and grace. Perhaps most significantly, the Chinese tradition preserved practical methods for achieving what they called immortality, not the indefinite extension of physical life, but rather the achievement of a state of consciousness that transcended the cycles of birth and death, while still being able to participate in them when necessary. This represented the ultimate goal of Taoist practice, the transformation of ordinary human consciousness into what the tradition called the immortal embryo, a refined form of awareness that could operate across multiple dimensions of existence. The medicine wheel turns with the seasons, and in its ancient rotation the keepers of the land whispered truths that would outlive empires. Across the vast territories of the Americas, from the Arctic tundra where aurora dances to the Amazon depths where jaguar dreams, indigenous peoples wove their deepest understanding into stories that breathed with the very pulse of the earth itself. In the lodges of the plains peoples, when winter winds carved silence from the frozen air, the elders would speak of Wakantanka, the great mystery that flowed through all things like blood through veins, like water through stone, like memory through generations. Their medicine wheels, carved in stone across hilltops and prairie rises, mapped not merely the cardinal directions but the architecture of existence itself. East held the energy of new beginnings, the yellow of sunrise and the eagle's keen sight that could perceive truth from great distances. South carried the red of passion and growth, the time of flowering and the bear's strength that could nurture or defend with equal power. West embraced the black of introspection and transformation, where the thunder beings brought rain and the buffalo taught sacrifice for the good of all. North embodied the white of wisdom and endurance, where the white wolf ran through dreams and ancestors spoke through winter's crystalline silence. But these were not mere directions, they were doorways into understanding that the physical and spiritual worlds interpenetrated like fingers interlaced, inseparable and interdependent. The medicine wheel taught that all knowledge was circular, that ending led to beginning, that death fed life, that individual wisdom meant nothing without community, and community could not thrive without individual responsibility. The Lakota spoke of Matakuye or Yasing, all my relations, a phrase that acknowledged the kinship between human beings and every other form of life. This was not romantic sentiment, but precise spiritual technology, a way of understanding that the web of existence was so intricately woven that harming any strand would inevitably weaken the whole. Their ceremonies, from the Sundance to the Vision Quest, were designed to strengthen these connections, to remind human consciousness of its place in the vast symphony of being. In the sweat lodge where steam rose from water poured over heated grandfather stones, participants experienced a kind of rebirth that dissolved the artificial boundaries between self and cosmos. The darkness within the lodge represented the womb of creation, the heat, the passionate energy of life, the prayers, the intention that guides manifestation. Emerging from the lodge was emerging from the womb of the earth itself, cleansed and renewed, carrying the responsibility to live in right relationship with all of life. The Hopi, whose name means peaceful people, preserved in their ceremonial cycle a cosmology that spanned multiple worlds of existence. Their prophecies spoke of humanity's emergence through successive worlds, each ending when people forgot their spiritual responsibilities and began to misuse their creative powers. They understood that consciousness itself was a sacred trust, that the capacity for thought and choice carried with it the obligation to consider the effects of one's actions on the seventh generation yet to come. Their Kachina ceremonies brought the spirits of rain, fertility and wisdom down from the high mesas to dance among the people, teaching that the boundary between the human and more than human worlds was permeable, requiring constant tending through ritual, respect and reciprocity. The carved Kachina dolls were not mere representations, but vessels for spiritual energy, teaching tools that connected children to the animate universe in which they would need to find their place. In the Amazon basin, where the green cathedral of rainforest held more species of life than anywhere else on Earth, the shamans, or ayahuasqueros, developed plant medicines that could dissolve the ego's illusion of separation and reveal the luminous connections between all forms of consciousness. They understood that plants were teachers, that the forest itself was a vast library of wisdom encoded in root and leaf, bark and flower. The vine ayahuasca, which they called the rope to heaven, contained alkaloids that could shift human consciousness into states where the molecular dance of life became visible, where the intentions of plants and animals could be directly perceived, where the past and future collapsed into an eternal, now pregnant with healing, possibility. But this was not escape from reality. It was entrance into a deeper reality, one that revealed the earth as a living being, of which human consciousness was both a part and a guardian. On the red continent at the bottom of the world, where the oldest continuous culture on Earth had tracked the stars for 60,000 years, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia developed a way of understanding that mapped the landscape as a repository of sacred story. Their dream time was not a distant past, but an eternal present, a dimension of reality where the ancestral beings continue to move through the land, creating and maintaining the world through their ongoing presence. The songlines, or tracks across the land, were paths of music and story that chronicled the journeys of these ancestral beings as they sang the world into existence. Every rock formation, every waterhole, every distinctive tree was a note in the vast symphony of creation, a verse in the epic poem of the earth. To walk the songlines was to participate in the ongoing creation of the world, to add one's voice to the chorus that kept the world alive through song. This understanding revealed geography not as empty space between destinations, but as sacred text written in stone and sand, water and wind. The land held memory, knowledge, law, and ceremony. To lose connection with the land was to lose connection with identity itself, because the landscape was the external form of internal wisdom, the mirror in which human consciousness could recognize its true nature. The concept of the dreaming taught that there were multiple levels of reality operating simultaneously. The physical world that could be perceived through the five senses was just one layer. Beneath it, or rather interpenetrating it, were the dreamtime dimensions where the ancestors continued their work of creation and maintenance. Through ceremony, initiation, and the careful cultivation of inner sight, individuals could learn to perceive and interact with these deeper levels of reality. This was shamanic knowledge of the highest order, the understanding that consciousness could travel, that the boundaries between different states of being were fluid, that the individual soul was connected to the eternal source of all creation through countless threads of kinship and responsibility. But it was also practical knowledge, how to find water in the desert, how to track animals across trackless land, how to predict weather patterns, how to maintain the delicate balance between human needs and ecological health. In the Torres Strait between Australia and Papua New Guinea, the islanders developed navigation techniques that allowed them to cross hundreds of miles of open ocean in outrigger canoes, guided only by their ability to read the patterns of waves, currents, and stars. They understood that the ocean was not an empty void, but a living entity with its own moods and rhythms, that successful navigation required not just technical skill, but spiritual attunement to the sea's changing personality. Their wave navigation system was based on the understanding that islands create distinctive patterns in the ocean surface, that swells bend and reflect in predictable ways as they encounter underwater reefs and landmasses. By feeling these patterns through the hull of their canoes, by watching the flight patterns of seabirds, by reading the colour and movement of clouds, they could navigate with precision that astonished European explorers who relied on compass and sextant. But beneath the technical knowledge lay a deeper understanding, that the navigator must become one with the ocean, must learn to think like water, must surrender individual will to the larger patterns of wind and tide. This was wisdom that recognized the illusory nature of the separate self, that understood individual consciousness as a temporary focusing of the universal mind, that found in surrender not defeat, but the discovery of one's true power. Across the Pacific, in the scattered islands of Polynesia, navigators developed perhaps the most sophisticated non-instrumental navigation system ever created. Using only their senses, and their deep knowledge of ocean patterns, star movements, and bird behaviour, they could sail thousands of miles across open ocean to land on islands barely visible above the horizon. Their knowledge was preserved not in written texts, but in the living memory of navigators who underwent decades of training to become human compasses, human charts, human weather stations. The master navigators, known as Palu, underwent initiation processes that transformed their entire way of perceiving the world. They learned to feel the movement of distant islands in the patterns of waves that reached their canoes, to read the presence of land in the reflection of waves off the underside of clouds, to navigate by the taste of water and the smell of wind. They memorized the rising and setting positions of over 200 stars, the seasonal movements of celestial bodies, the migration patterns of dozens of seabirds. But perhaps most remarkably, they learned to navigate using a mental technique called ATAC, which involved imagining their canoe as stationary while the islands moved around them. This required a complete reversal of ordinary perception, a way of experiencing space and movement that dissolved the fixed categories of here and there, self and other, journey and destination. The navigator became the still centre around which the entire ocean turned, the point of consciousness through which the universe moved itself. This navigation system was more than practical technology. It was a form of applied mysticism, a way of using expanded consciousness for concrete purposes. The navigator had to enter a state of complete openness, of receptivity to subtle signals that required the ego mind to step aside so that deeper forms of knowing could emerge. In this state, the boundary between navigator and ocean dissolved, and the canoe was guided not by individual will, but by a kind of oceanic intelligence that flowed through the prepared consciousness of the Palu. In the highlands of Tibet, where the air grows thin and the boundaries between earth and sky seem to dissolve, Buddhist yogis developed techniques for navigating inner space with the same precision that Polynesian navigators brought to the outer ocean. Their maps were charts of consciousness itself, detailed descriptions of the stages of meditation, the obstacles and opportunities that arise as awareness learns to recognize its own true nature. The Tibetan understanding of Bardo, the gap between thoughts, the space between breaths, the interval between death and rebirth, revealed that ordinary consciousness was just one frequency in a vast spectrum of possible awareness. Through careful training in meditation and dream yoga, practitioners could learn to maintain conscious awareness during states that normally obliterate individual identity: deep sleep, the death process, the transition between incarnations. This was not abstract philosophy, but precise cartography of inner terrain, complete with landmarks, hazards, and reliable routes through the labyrinth of consciousness. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was essentially a travel guide for navigating the afterlife, but it was based on the understanding that the Bardo states could be explored while still alive through meditation, lucid dreaming, and the cultivation of what they called clear light awareness. The clear light was understood to be the fundamental nature of mind itself, the pure awareness that underlies all mental activity, the space in which thoughts and emotions arise and dissolve. By learning to rest in this spacious awareness, practitioners could maintain conscious continuity through states that would normally fragment or obliterate individual identity. This was practical immortality, not the preservation of the ego, but the recognition of the deathless nature of awareness itself. In the caves of Ajanta and Ellora, carved from living rock over centuries of devotion, Buddhist and Hindu artists created visual narratives that served as meditation instructions, as teaching stories, and as invitations into states of consciousness where the ordinary boundaries of self and world dissolved into recognition of universal interconnection. The spiraling forms, the dancing figures, the intricate geometric patterns were not mere decoration but spiritual technology, designed to guide the viewer's consciousness through specific transformative experiences. The Hindu understanding of Maya, the creative power of consciousness that manifests the apparent world of multiplicity, revealed that what we take to be solid reality is actually more like a dream, a play of light and shadow projected by awareness onto the screen of space. But this was not nihilistic denial of the world's reality. Instead, it was recognition that the world is real in the same way that a dream is real, as an expression of consciousness, as a creative act of the divine mind. This understanding liberated practitioners from the suffering caused by taking appearances to be ultimate truth, while simultaneously revealing the sacred nature of all phenomena. If everything is consciousness in disguise, then everything is worthy of reverence. If the world is the divine dreaming itself into form, then every moment is an opportunity for recognition, for remembering the dreamer behind the dream. In the great libraries of Africa, before the flames of invasion consumed the manuscripts of Timbuktu, scholars and griots preserved vast libraries of knowledge in the architecture of memory itself. The oral traditions of West Africa developed mnemonic systems so sophisticated that entire epics could be preserved word for word across generations, with built-in error correction mechanisms that ensured the integrity of transmission. The griots, the hereditary keepers of history and wisdom, underwent training that transformed their minds into living libraries. They learned not just to memorize stories, but to embody them, to become vessels through which the voices of ancestors could speak to the present generation. Their performances were not mere entertainment, but sacred acts of remembrance, ways of keeping the past alive in the present, of ensuring that the wisdom of the elders would continue to guide the community. The epic of Sundiata, the founding emperor of the Mali Empire, was preserved through such oral tradition for over 700 years before being written down. But the written version could capture only the bare skeleton of the story. The living performance, with its intricate patterns of rhythm and melody, its responsorial interplay between griot and audience, its adaptation to specific circumstances and listeners, carried meanings that could never be fixed in text. This was understanding encoded in process, rather than product. Wisdom that lived only in the dynamic relationship between teller and listener, past and present, individual and community. The griot was simultaneously historian, entertainer, counsellor and priest, weaving together the threads of memory into patterns that could guide present action and inspire future possibility. The Yoruba concept of Arse, the creative force that flows through all existence, the power of the word to manifest reality, revealed that language itself was a form of magic, that the stories we tell about ourselves and our world have the power to create the future. The griots understood that they were not just preserving the past, but actively shaping the future through the way they told the ancient stories. In the Dogon cosmology of Mali, star knowledge was encoded in ritual and ceremony that revealed sophisticated understanding of astronomical phenomena unknown to European science until the 20th century. Their knowledge of the binary nature of Sirius, the orbital period of its companion star, the spiral structure of galaxies, was preserved not in written texts, but in the symbolic language of masks and dances, initiation ceremonies and sacred architecture. The Dogon understood that knowledge was not mere information, but living power that required proper preparation and context to be safely transmitted. Their initiation systems were designed to transform the consciousness of the recipient, to prepare them to handle wisdom that could be dangerous if misunderstood or misused. Knowledge was not commodity but sacred trust, not possession but relationship, not power over but power with. Their understanding of Nommo, the amphibious beings who they claimed had brought knowledge from the Sirius system, whether taken literally or metaphorically, pointed to the understanding that human consciousness was not isolated, but connected to intelligence that pervaded the cosmos. The same force that organised the spiral dance of galaxies was organising the neural patterns in human brains. The same intelligence that guided the migration of birds was available to guide human evolution. In the highlands of Ethiopia, the Flasher, the Ethiopian Jews, preserved ancient traditions that had been lost in other Jewish communities. Their version of Judaism retained elements that predated the destruction of the Second Temple, practices and understandings that had been filtered out of mainstream Jewish development but preserved in the mountainous isolation of the Ethiopian highlands. Their monastic traditions, their emphasis on purity laws, their preservation of ancient prayers and ceremonies created a window into forms of Jewish practice that had evolved independently from rabbinical Judaism. But more than historical curiosity, their traditions preserved understandings of the sacred that emphasized direct mystical experience over textual interpretation, personal relationship with the divine over institutional mediation. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, with its rock-hewn churches of Lalibla carved from living stone, its preservation of ancient languages and liturgies, its integration of African and Middle Eastern spiritual traditions created a unique synthesis that preserved wisdom elements that had been lost elsewhere. Their understanding of Christ as the cosmic dancer, their integration of indigenous African spiritual practices with Christian theology, their emphasis on contemplative practice and mystical union offered alternative pathways to spiritual realization. In the Kalahari Desert, where the San people had survived for thousands of years as hunter-gatherers, shamanic practices preserved understanding of consciousness that recognized no separation between the human and more than human worlds. Their trance dances, powered by rhythmic breathing and prolonged movement, could induce states of consciousness where individuals could perceive and interact with spiritual realities normally invisible to ordinary awareness. Their rock art, painted on cave walls and stone outcroppings across southern Africa, documented shamanic experiences spanning thousands of years. The images of humans transforming into animals, of figures with streams of light emanating from their bodies, of beings moving between different levels of reality, were not fantasy but documentary reports from explorers of inner space, maps of consciousness, Shim. Territories accessible to anyone willing to undertake the necessary training and preparation. The San concept of the Great Dance, the understanding that all of existence is engaged in a cosmic celebration, that every movement and moment is part of the vast choreography of joy, offered an alternative to worldviews based on struggle, competition, and scarcity. Their way of life demonstrated that human beings could live lightly on the earth, taking only what was needed, leaving the landscape richer rather than poorer for their presence. As the firelight dims and the voices of the ancestors fade into the spaces between heartbeats, these streams of ancient wisdom begin to converge, their separate melodies weaving together into a symphony of understanding that speaks to the deepest needs of our time. The medicine wheel and the song lines, the navigation by stars and the maps of consciousness, the preservation of memory and the power of story, all point toward ways of being human that honour both individual awakening and collective responsibility, that recognise the sacred in the ordinary, that understand consciousness not as accident, but as the universe coming to know itself through countless eyes. But there are deeper currents still to explore, older wisdoms that lie at the very roots of human understanding, where the first sparks of symbolic thought began to kindle the fires of meaning that would eventually illuminate the entire journey of human consciousness. In the caves where our ancestors first began to dream in pictures, in the circles of standing stones where they learned to dance with the rhythms of earth and sky, in the earlier stories that tried to make sense of birth and death, love and loss, power and surrender, lie the seeds of all the wisdom traditions that would follow. The wind carries whispers across the threshold of worlds, where the final chapter of humanity's greatest secret unfolds in the space between sleeping and waking, between myth and memory. Here, in this sacred silence, the deepest mysteries reveal themselves not as answers, but as eternal questions that have shaped every civilization, every dream, every prayer whispered into the darkness since the first human gazed upon the stars and wondered at their meaning. In the traditions of the eternal return preserved in the cyclical myths of cultures separated by oceans and millennia, lies perhaps the most profound secret of all, the understanding that time itself is not a straight line but a spiral, ever returning to the same sacred moments, the same cosmic rhythms that our ancestors recognized in the turning of seasons, the phases of the moon, the endless dance of death and rebirth that governs all existence. The Aboriginal Dreamtime speaks of this eternal now, where the ancestors still walk the land, their footsteps creating the very landscape, their songs still echoing in the red earth and sacred stones. In this conception, the myths are not stories of the past, but living realities that exist simultaneously with our present moment, accessible through the proper rituals, the correct songs, the ancient pathways that connect the visible world with the realm of spirits and eternal beings. Similarly, the Hindu concept of cosmic cycles, the vast wheels of time that turn through ages of gold, silver, bronze and iron, reveals an understanding of time that encompasses not just human history but the breathing of the universe itself, each cycle lasting millions of years, each ending in dissolution and renewal, each carrying within it the seeds of all the cycles that came before and all that will come after. The Maya, master astronomers and mathematicians, encoded this same understanding in their complex calendar systems, calculating not just the movements of planets and stars but the great cycles of human consciousness, the rises and falls of civilizations, the moments when the veils between worlds grow thin and the ancient knowledge can be transmitted from one age to the next. In the Norse tradition, Ragnarok represents not just an ending, but a renewal, the death of gods and the birth of new ones, the destruction of the old world and the emergence of a new earth, green and fertile, where the eternal cycles begin again. This myth encodes the profound understanding that destruction and creation are not opposites, but partners in the great dance of existence. The Aztec understanding of the 5 suns, the 5 great ages of the world, each ending in catastrophe and beginning in renewal, reveals the same cyclical wisdom. Each age brings its own challenges, its own opportunities for growth and learning, its own gifts to the eternal spiral of consciousness that moves through time like a river flowing both forward and backward simultaneously. These myths of eternal return carry within them the secret of how ancient knowledge survives the collapse of civilizations, not through books or monuments, which can be destroyed, but through the living tradition of storytelling, through the genetic memory that carries the wisdom of ancestors and the very structure of consciousness itself. The Celtic understanding of the other world, where time moves differently, and where the ancestors dwell in eternal youth and wisdom, reveals another layer of this mystery. The thin places, the sacred sites where the veil between worlds is gossamer thin, are not just geographical locations but moments in time when the cyclical nature of existence becomes visible, when the eternal return manifests in the present moment. In the shamanic traditions of Siberia, the world tree connects all the levels of existence, the underworld, the middle world, and the upper world, not as separate realms but as aspects of a single unified reality that exists in eternal return. The shaman's journey up and down this tree is not just a spiritual practice but a technological method for accessing the cyclical nature of time, for moving between the layers of reality that exist simultaneously. The African traditions speak of the ancestors as living presences who continue to influence and guide the present moment, their wisdom available to those who know how to listen, how to participate in the eternal conversation between past, present, and future. This understanding reveals that the ancestors are not gone, but are present in every moment, their knowledge flowing through the bloodlines, through the songs, through the sacred practices that connect each generation to the eternal source. The greatest secret hidden in myths is not that they are stories of the past, but that they are living realities that continue to unfold in the present moment. The heroes and gods, the monsters and wise ones, the journeys and transformations, all of these exist not as historical events, but as eternal patterns that manifest in every life, in every moment of choice, in every crossing of the threshold between the known and the unknown. Carl Jung's recognition of the collective unconscious points toward this truth, that the mythological patterns are not just cultural artifacts, but the very structure of consciousness itself, the deep grammar of the human psyche that operates beneath the surface of everyday awareness. The archetypes that appear in myths around the world are not just symbols, but living forces that shape human experience, that guide the soul's journey through the labyrinth of existence. The hero's journey, identified by Joseph Campbell in his study of world mythology, reveals the fundamental pattern of transformation that governs not just ancient stories, but the structure of every human life. The call to adventure, the crossing of the threshold, the trials and tribulations, the moment of greatest darkness, the discovery of the treasure, the return to the ordinary world. These are not just stages in a story, but the actual phases of psychological and spiritual development that every soul must navigate. In the Tibetan tradition, the bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth, is understood as a realm where the mythological figures appear not as external entities but as projections of the dying person's own consciousness. The peaceful and wrathful deities, the various realms and temptations, the opportunities for liberation, all of these are revealed to be aspects of the mind itself, mythological patterns that exist within the very structure of awareness. The Gnostic understanding of the demiurge and the pleroma reveals another layer of this living mythology. The material world is not separate from the spiritual realm, but is itself a mythological construction, a dream within a dream, where the soul plays out its ancient dramas of forgetting and remembering, of fallen redemption, of separation and return to the source. The Islamic concept of the perfect man, the fully realized human being who serves as the bridge between earth and heaven, appears in various forms throughout world mythology. The Bodhisattva of Buddhism, the Tzaddik of Judaism, the saint of Christianity, the wise king of ancient traditions, all represent the same mythological pattern of the human being who has achieved the integration of earthly and heavenly consciousness. The alchemical tradition, with its complex symbolism of metals and processes, operations and transformations, reveals itself to be a mythological system for understanding the process of consciousness itself. The prima materia, the various stages of dissolution and coagulation, the final achievement of the philosopher's stone. These are not just chemical processes, but mythological descriptions of the soul's journey toward wholeness and integration. The Kabbalistic tree of life, with its 10 Sephiroth and 22 paths, is both a map of the cosmos and a description of the journey of consciousness through the various levels of reality. Each Sephirah represents not just an abstract principle, but a living mythological realm, populated by angels and demons, forces of creation and destruction, opportunities for ascent and descent. The Hindu understanding of the chakras reveals another layer of living mythology. The various energy centers in the body are not just anatomical features, but mythological realms, each with its own deities and demons, its own challenges and opportunities for transformation. The journey of Kundalini from the base of the spine to the crown of the head is the same mythological journey that appears in countless stories of heroes climbing the world mountain, ascending the cosmic tree, or scaling the ladder to heaven. The Native American medicine wheel reveals the cyclical nature of living mythology. The 4 directions, the 4 seasons, the 4 stages of life, these are not just organizing principles, but mythological patterns that govern the movement of consciousness through time and space. The Vision Quest, the Sweat Lodge, the Sun Dance, these are not just ceremonies, but technologies for accessing the living mythology that exists within the natural world. The Australian Aboriginal understanding of the dream time reveals perhaps the most complete picture of living mythology. The ancestors who created the land through their journeys and adventures are not historical figures, but eternal presences who continue to shape reality through their ongoing dreaming. The songlines that crisscross the continent are not just geographical features, but mythological highways, pathways of consciousness that connect all beings to the eternal source of creation. Hidden within the heart of every myth lies a secret teaching, a transmission of wisdom that can only be understood by those who have developed the eyes to see and the ears to hear. These teachings are not hidden because they are forbidden, but because they can only be received by consciousness that has been prepared through the proper disciplines, the correct understanding, the gradual awakening of the faculties that perceive the deeper dimensions of reality. The Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece offered initiates a direct experience of the secret hidden in the myth of Demeter and Persephone, the death and rebirth of the grain goddess, the descent into the underworld, and the return to the world above, the eternal cycle of seasons and souls. These were not just stories to be believed, but realities to be experienced, transformations to be lived, mysteries to be embodied. The initiates who emerged from the sacred chambers at Eleusis were said to have lost their fear of death, to have gained a direct understanding of the continuity of consciousness beyond the dissolution of the physical form. They had received the secret teaching that death is not an ending, but a transformation, not a termination, but a translation from one level of existence to another. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, more accurately translated as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, contains the secret teachings encoded in the mythological journey of the soul through the underworld. The various trials and transformations, the encounters with gods and demons, the final judgment before Osiris, these are not just descriptions of what happens after death, but instructions for navigating the deeper levels of consciousness that exist within life itself. The secret teaching hidden in the Osiris myth is the understanding that the divine nature of the human being is not something to be achieved, but something to be remembered, not something foreign to be acquired, but something integral to be awakened. The dismemberment and reassembly of Osiris represents the necessary fragmentation of ego consciousness and its reconstruction around the divine centre that exists within every human heart. The Orphic mysteries of ancient Greece contained the secret teaching that the soul is divine by nature but has forgotten its true identity through its involvement with the material world. The mythological journey of Orpheus into the underworld to retrieve his beloved Eurydice represents the soul's journey back to its source, the return to the divine realm from which it originally descended. The secret teaching hidden in this myth is that the divine realm is not a place to be reached, but a state of consciousness to be realized, not a destination to be achieved, but a remembrance to be awakened. The tragic ending of the myth, Orpheus losing Eurydice because he looked back, reveals the delicate nature of this remembrance, the need for complete faith and trust in the process of return. The Mithraic mysteries, popular among Roman soldiers, contain the secret teaching of the soul's journey through the 7 planetary spheres, each representing a different level of consciousness, a different stage of initiation. The mythological figure of Mithra slaying the bull represents the conquest of the lower nature, the transformation of animal instincts into spiritual power. The secret teaching hidden in Mithraism is the understanding that the spiritual path is not a rejection of the material world, but a transformation of it, not an escape from physical existence, but a divinization of it. The initiate learns to see the divine presence in all things, to recognize the sacred in the ordinary, to find the eternal in the temporal. The Hermetic tradition, with its teaching as above, so below, contains the secret understanding that the macrocosm and microcosm are not separate realities, but aspects of a single unified existence. The alchemical work of transforming base metals into gold represents the inner work of transforming human consciousness from its ordinary state to its divine potential. The secret teaching hidden in Hermeticism is that the divine is not separate from the human, but is the deepest essence of human nature, waiting to be awakened through the proper understanding and practice. The Emerald Tablet, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, contains the fundamental principles of this transformation, encoded in symbolic language that reveals its secrets only to those who have prepared themselves to receive them. The Christian Gnostic traditions contained secret teachings about the true nature of Christ, understood not just as a historical figure, but as the divine principle within every human being. The mythological stories of the Gnostic texts, the Sophia myth, the journey of the soul through the archons, the final return to the pleroma, represent the soul's journey of awakening to its divine nature. The secret teaching hidden in Gnosticism is that salvation is not something to be achieved through external means, but something to be awakened through direct knowledge, through gnosis, through the immediate recognition of the divine nature that exists within consciousness itself. The elaborate mythological systems of the Gnostics are not just cosmological theories, but practical instructions for navigating the levels of reality that exist within the human psyche. The Sufi understanding of the beloved, expressed in the mystical poetry of Rumi, Hafez, and countless others, contains the secret teaching that the divine is not distant but intimately present, not other but the very essence of the self. The mythological journey of the lover seeking the beloved represents the soul's recognition that what it seeks is what it already is, that the goal of the journey is the beginning of the journey. The secret teaching hidden in Sufism is that the divine names and qualities are not just attributes of God, but the very structure of human consciousness, the fundamental patterns that govern the movement of awareness through the various levels of reality. The Dika, the remembrance of God, is not just a devotional practice but a technology for awakening the divine names within the heart. In the deepest chambers of mythological wisdom lies the ultimate secret, that reality itself is a dream and consciousness is the dreamer. This understanding, which appears in various forms throughout world mythology, reveals that the apparent separation between the subjective and objective objective worlds is itself a mythological construction, a necessary illusion that allows the one consciousness to experience itself as many, the eternal to experience itself as temporal, the infinite to experience itself as finite. The Hindu concept of Maya reveals this understanding in its most developed form. The world is not an illusion in the sense of being unreal, but it is a dream in the sense of being a projection of consciousness, a play of awareness that appears to be separate from its source, but is actually non-different from it. The mythological stories of the gods and their adventures are not just entertaining tales, but descriptions of the various modes of consciousness, the different ways that the one awareness manifests itself in the world of experience. The Advaita Vedanta teaching that Tattvam Asi, thou art that, reveals the ultimate secret hidden in all mythology. The seeker and the sought, the hero and the goal, the devotee and the deity, all are appearances within the one consciousness that is the true nature of all existence. The mythological journey is not a movement from one place to another, but a recognition of what was always already present, a remembrance of what was never actually forgotten. The Buddhist understanding of the emptiness of all phenomena points toward the same truth. The various realms described in Buddhist cosmology, the god realms, the human realm, the hungry ghost realm, the hell realms, are not separate locations but states of consciousness, different modes of experience that arise and pass away within the space of awareness itself. The Zen teaching that original mind is Buddha reveals that the awakened state is not something to be achieved but something to be recognized, not something koan to be acquired, but something natural to be uncovered. The various koans and teaching stories of the Zen tradition are not just puzzles to be solved, but pointers to the immediate recognition of the true nature of mind. The Taoist understanding of the Tao as the source and substance of all existence reveals that the mythological distinction between the natural and supernatural worlds is itself a conceptual construction. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. It exists before and beyond all mythological categories, all conceptual frameworks, all attempts to capture it in words or images. The Aboriginal Dreamtime reveals perhaps the most complete understanding of reality as dream. The ancestors who created the world through their dreaming are not historical figures but eternal aspects of consciousness itself, the fundamental patterns that govern the manifestation of the world in each moment. The songlines that connect all places and beings are not just geographical features, but the very structure of consciousness, the pathways along which awareness moves in its eternal dreaming. The shamanic understanding of the multiple worlds, the lower world, the middle world, and the upper world, reveals that these are not separate realms, but different modes of consciousness, different ways of experiencing the same fundamental reality. The shaman's journey between worlds is not a movement through space, but a shift in awareness, a change in the mode of consciousness that reveals different aspects of the eternal dream. The Kabbalistic understanding of the four worlds, the world of action, the world of formation, the world of creation, and the world of emanation, reveals the same truth. These are not separate realms, but different levels of the same reality, different densities of the same divine light, different modes of the same eternal consciousness. The alchemical understanding of the prima materia, the first matter from which all things emerge, points toward the recognition that consciousness itself is the fundamental substance of reality, the underlying matrix from which all experience arises. The various operations of alchemy, dissolution, coagulation, sublimation, putrefaction, are not just chemical processes, but descriptions of the movements of consciousness as it transforms itself from one mode to another. The Hermetic understanding that mind is the master weaver of reality reveals that the mythological worlds are not separate from consciousness, but are consciousness itself, appearing to itself in the form of experience. The various planes of reality described in Hermetic cosmology are not separate locations but different frequencies of the same fundamental awareness, different octaves of the same eternal song. The Christian mystic understanding of the divine darkness, the cloud of unknowing, points toward the recognition that the ultimate reality transcends all mythological categories, all conceptual frameworks. all attempts to grasp it with the mind. The via negativa, the path of negation, reveals that the divine is not a thing among things, but the no-thing that is the source and substance of all things. The Islamic understanding of the unity of existence, wahdat al-wujud, reveals that the apparent multiplicity of the world is a manifestation of the one reality, a dream within the divine consciousness. The various levels of existence described in Islamic cosmology, the realm of the senses, the realm of the imagination, the realm of the intellect, the realm of the spirit, are not separate worlds but different modes of the same divine awareness. The ultimate secret hidden in mythology is that the awakening is not something that happens to consciousness, but something that consciousness recognizes it has always been. The mythological journey of the hero, the seeker, the initiate, is not a movement from ignorance to knowledge, but a recognition of the knowledge that was always present, a remembrance of the truth that was never actually forgotten. The various stages of the mythological journey, the call to adventure, the refusal of the call, the crossing of the threshold, the road of trials, the approach to the inmost cave, the ordeal, the reward, the road back, the resurrection, the return with the elixir, are not just narrative structures but descriptions of the movements of consciousness as it awakens to its own true nature. The call to adventure represents the first stirring of spiritual longing, the initial recognition that the ordinary world is not sufficient, that there is something more to be discovered, something deeper to be explored. This call comes not from outside but from within, not from the world but from the heart, not from circumstances but from the innate wisdom that recognizes its own divine nature. The refusal of the call represents the natural resistance of the ego mind to the process of transformation, the fear of the unknown, the attachment to the familiar patterns of identity and experience. This refusal is not a failure but a necessary stage in the journey, a moment of gathering strength and preparation for the challenges that lie ahead. The crossing of the threshold represents the moment of commitment to the spiritual path, the decision to leave the familiar world behind and enter the realm of the unknown. This crossing is not a physical movement but a shift in consciousness, a change in the fundamental orientation of awareness from the external to the internal, from the temporal to the eternal. The road of trials represents the various challenges and obstacles that arise on the spiritual path, the tests and temptations that reveal the strength and purity of the seeker's intention. These trials are not arbitrary difficulties but necessary purifications, opportunities for the ego mind to be refined and transformed, for consciousness to be prepared for the deeper revelations that lie ahead. The approach to the inmost cave represents the moment when the seeker comes face to face with the deepest fears and resistances, the final barriers that separate consciousness from its source. This approach is not a movement through space but a descent into the depths of the psyche, a journey into the unconscious, where the fundamental patterns of identity and experience are revealed and transformed. The ordeal represents the moment of greatest challenge, the dark night of the soul, when everything that was familiar and secure is dissolved, when the ego mind faces its ultimate dissolution. This ordeal is not a punishment but a gift, not a failure but a success, not a death but a birth into a new mode of being. The reward represents the treasure that is discovered in the depths of the ordeal, the recognition of the divine nature that has always been present, but was obscured by the patterns of ego consciousness. This reward is not something foreign to be acquired, but something integral to be recognized, not something to be grasped, but something to be surrendered to. The road back represents the integration of the spiritual realization into ordinary life, the return to the world with the wisdom and compassion that have been awakened through the journey. This return is not a movement backward, but a movement forward, not a regression but a progression, not a loss but a gain. The resurrection represents the moment when the old patterns of identity and experience are transformed by the realization of the divine nature. This resurrection is not a return to the previous state, but a translation into a new mode of being, not a restoration but a transformation, not a repetition but a renewal. The return with the elixir represents the sharing of the wisdom and compassion that have been awakened through the journey. the transmission of the divine light that has been recognized within consciousness. This return is not just a personal achievement but a service to all beings, not just an individual awakening but a contribution to the collective evolution of consciousness. The various wisdom traditions offer different maps of this journey, different descriptions of the stages and processes involved in the awakening of consciousness to its own true nature, but all point toward the same fundamental recognition that the divine is not separate from the human, but is the very essence of human nature, that the sacred is not distant but intimately present, that the eternal is not future but always now. The Zen tradition speaks of sudden awakening, the immediate recognition of the Buddha and nature that has always been present. The Christian mystics speak of the mystical marriage, the union of the soul with God that reveals their eternal non-separation. The Hindu tradition speaks of self-realization, the recognition of the Atman that is identical with Brahman. The Sufi tradition speaks of Fana, the extinction of the ego in the beloved that reveals the eternal unity. All of these descriptions point toward the same recognition, that the mythological journey is ultimately a journey home, a return to the source from which consciousness never actually departed. The various stages and processes, the challenges and revelations, the deaths and rebirths, all are movements within the eternal dance of consciousness. Waves arising and subsiding in the ocean of awareness that is the true nature of all existence. As the final whispers of ancient wisdom fade into the silence of eternity, we find ourselves at the threshold of a profound recognition. The myths and legends, the stories and symbols that have guided humanity through the labyrinth of existence are not relics of the past, but living realities that continue to unfold in the depths of consciousness itself. The lost knowledge hidden in mythology is not something that was once known and then forgotten, but something that is always present, always available, always ready to be recognized by those who have developed the capacity to see beyond the veil of appearances. This knowledge is not esoteric in the sense of being available only to a chosen few, but esoteric in the sense of being accessible only to those who have prepared themselves through the proper understanding and practice. The great secret is that there is no secret, only the recognition of what has always been present, the remembrance of what was never actually forgotten, the awakening to what has always been awake. The mythological journey is not a movement from ignorance to knowledge, but a recognition of the knowledge that is the very nature of consciousness itself. The various traditions and teachings, the different maps and methods, the diverse symbols and practices, all are fingers pointing at the same moon, waves arising in the same ocean, dreams occurring within the same dreamer. The ultimate teaching is not a doctrine to be learned, but a reality to be lived, not a theory to be understood, but a truth to be embodied. The eternal story continues to unfold in each moment of awareness, in each breath of consciousness, in each heartbeat of existence. The mythological patterns that have guided humanity for millennia continue to operate within the depths of the psyche, shaping experience, guiding evolution, revealing the sacred in the ordinary, the eternal in the temporal, the infinite in the finite. The lost knowledge is not lost, but lives on in the very structure of consciousness itself, in the fundamental patterns that govern the movement of awareness through the various levels of reality. This knowledge is transmitted not through books or teachers, but through the direct experience of the divine nature that is the essence of human existence. The myths continue to be born in the depths of the unconscious, the archetypal patterns continue to manifest in the world of experience, the eternal symbols continue to reveal their secrets to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. The great story of consciousness awakening to its own nature continues to unfold in the heart of every being, in the core of every experience, in the essence of every moment. And so the journey continues, not as a movement from here to there, but as a deepening recognition of what is always here, not as a progression from past to future, but as an eternal return to the present moment, not as a seeking for something that is absent, but as a celebration of what is always present. The whispers of the ancestors echo in the silence of the heart. The wisdom of the ages flows through the channels of consciousness. The light of the eternal shines in the darkness of the moment. The mythological journey is not a story to be told, but a reality to be lived. Not a path to be travelled, but a truth to be recognised. Not a destination to be reached, but a recognition to be awakened. In the end, there is no end. Only the eternal beginning, the endless awakening, the infinite recognition of the divine nature that is the source and substance of all existence. The lost knowledge is found in the very seeking. The hidden wisdom is revealed in the very searching. The secret teaching is transmitted in the very longing for truth. The eternal story continues, and we are both its authors and its characters, both its dreamers and its dreams, both its seekers and its sought. In the silence between the words, in the space between the thoughts, in the pause between the breaths, the greatest mystery reveals itself. Not as something to be solved, but as something to be lived. Not as a problem to be understood, but as a reality to be embodied. Not as a secret to be discovered, but as a truth to be recognized. The mythological journey ends where it began, in the eternal now, in the infinite here, in the divine presence that is always available, always accessible, always ready to reveal itself to those who have prepared themselves to receive the greatest gift of all, the recognition of their own divine nature, the remembrance of their eternal identity, the awakening to the truth that they have always been what they have always sought. And in this recognition, in this remembrance, in this awakening, the lost knowledge is found, the hidden wisdom is revealed, the secret teaching is transmitted, not as information to be stored, but as transformation to be lived, not as knowledge to be possessed, but as reality to be become, not as truth to be grasped, but as being to be embodied. The eternal story continues and will always continue in the depths of consciousness itself, in the heart of every being, in the core of every experience, in the essence of every moment. The mythology is not just about the past, but about the eternal present. Not just about the gods, but about the divine nature that is the essence of human existence. Not just about the heroes, but about the hero that is the true nature of consciousness itself. In the silence that follows the last word, in the peace that transcends all understanding, in the love that is the very nature of existence, the greatest secret reveals itself, not as something to be known, but as something to be. Not as something to be achieved, but as something to be recognized. Not as something to be sought, but as something to be celebrated. The lost knowledge hidden in myths is not lost at all. It lives on in the very fabric of consciousness, in the fundamental patterns that govern the movement of awareness, in the eternal dance of recognition and remembrance that is the true nature of existence itself. And in recognizing this, in remembering this, in awakening to this, we discover that we have always been what we have always sought. We have always known what we have always searched for. We have always been home in the very journey that seemed to lead us away from home. The eternal story continues, and we are eternally part of it, eternally writing it, eternally living it, eternally awakening to the truth that we are not separate from the story, but are the very consciousness in which all stories arise and subside, the very awareness in which all myths are born and return, the very being in which all knowledge is hidden and revealed. And so the journey ends where it began and begins where it ends, in the eternal circle of awakening consciousness, in the infinite spiral of recognition and remembrance, in the divine dance of being and becoming that is the true nature of existence itself. The lost knowledge is found, the hidden wisdom is revealed, the secret teaching is transmitted, not as something external to be acquired, but as something internal to be recognized, not as something foreign to be learned, but as something native to be remembered, not as something absent to be sought, but as something present to be celebrated. In the final silence, in the ultimate peace, in the eternal love that is the very nature of consciousness itself, the greatest mystery reveals itself as the greatest simplicity, the deepest secret as the most obvious truth, the most hidden knowledge as the most present reality. And in this revelation, in this recognition, in this remembrance, the mythological journey is complete. Not as an ending, but as a beginning, not as a conclusion, but as an opening, not as a destination, but as a recognition that we have always been home, have always been whole, have always been the very truth that we have always sought. The eternal story continues, and will always continue, in the depths of every heart, in the silence of every mind, in the peace of every soul, in the love of every being. The mythology lives on, not as ancient history, but as present reality, not as past wisdom, but as eternal truth, not as lost knowledge, but as ever-present awareness, always ready to reveal itself to those who have prepared themselves to receive the greatest gift of all, the recognition of their own divine nature, the remembrance of their eternal identity, the awakening to the truth that they have always been what they have always sought. If this story stayed with you as you drifted off, support the channel by liking, sharing and subscribing. We release weekly journeys into the forgotten, and every dreaming soul is welcome here.